So now I'd like to introduce our first international keynote speaker. It's Rick Ritter, who's from Colorado in the States, and he's been a consultant, a political consultant for the last 30 years. He has worked for the Clintons and for numerous American politicians. But he's not one of those typical American political consultants who's coming from the States to Europe and tell us how we should do things and, just raise a lot of money and do it the American way. Because Rick has actually worked in more than 20 different countries around the world, from Sweden, Australia, and even here in Denmark, he has advised politicians on how to put together their message and their campaigning. So he's a guy who has a lot of a good international reputation, and also has a lot of friends here in Denmark. So I think with no further ado, Rick, I'd like to ask you on stage. Please give a big hand to Rick Ritter.
So thank you very much, Astrid, and I really appreciate coming here. In preparation for this this visit to Denmark, I have spent the last 30 hours watching Borgen. And I can now say properly, hi, and that apparently my occupation is known as Spinmeister. But what is interesting about this group of people, as I look at you, I realize that you're pretty sick individuals. And the reason I say that is that normal human beings don't come into a room for 15, 30, 45 minutes to talk about politics. The average American thinks about politics a total of 12 minutes over the course of a 2-year period. So, that shows you how sick you guys are compared to the rest of the world. Because people like you don't come into a room like this and talk about politics, which makes it very difficult for those of us who are sick to communicate to those people who are really quite well. We don't want to try to give them the virus of politics necessarily, lest they become like us. But what we do want to do is try to create the sense that we can communicate with them about our issues, about our concerns, about a whole array of activities that we feel are important for them, for our society, if not for the world. But often, we get perplexed, and we run into problems that we can't even anticipate. And so it was about 30 years ago, and I asked during the next 20 minutes for you to think about what your response would be as a political spokesperson, spinmeister, if you will, to this problem. I was a campaign manager who had just left a presidential campaign, and I was working in the deep south of the United States. And for those of you who don't know, the deep south has very strong accents. And I was working for a woman who 15 years before had left New York City. And she was running for office in this state in the Deep South. And I get a phone call from my press secretary. And the press secretary says, "We've got a problem." Now, I had just left a presidential campaign, so I thought, with me in charge, there's no problem, right? She said, "We got a problem." I said, "What's the problem?" She said, "Well, at that press conference at the tobacco barn." And I said, "Yeah." And I said, "Yeah, it should have been very easy for her." She said, "Yes, it was, initially." He said, "Well, what happened?" He said, "Well, the first question was, why do you like this state?" And I said, "Well, that's a home run. This is easy. Talk about the mountains, the people." He said, "Yeah, she answered that fine." I said, so what's the problem? It was the second question. And I said, what was the second question? What don't you like about the state? I said, well, that's a home run too. She should have said. He said, no, she didn't. Whatever you think she said, that's not what she said. I said, so what did she say? He said slowly, I believe the exact quote is, I hate Southern accents. So since that time, I have always tried to figure out what was the proper response to the press about how I could spin that particular offense to the entire population of the state. And I have yet to find it. So I would ask upon you in this crowd, if at the end of this you have an answer, I'd love to hear it. About 2 months ago, a friend of mine called me and said, I need a memo from you. I said, what is it? He said, what has changed in the last 8 years in American presidential politics as well as world politics in terms of campaigns? And what are the big differences between what we did in 2007, 2008, and what we do today? And I took it upon myself to take that challenge. And the first thing I said to him is, look, if you can't count it, it didn't happen. That's rule number one. Today's world in campaigns is about analytics, it's about metrics, it's about measuring success, it's about measuring failure, it's about measuring what works. No longer can you say, well, we won, so whatever we did worked. Doesn't go that way any longer. We measure the number of Facebook likes. We measure the number of openings of an email versus a different type of subject lines opening. We measure the frequency of television ads and whether or not they're working or not. And we change different direction based on numeric valuation. We even measure the distance between an office door and the reception desk. It's 20 feet. That's the optimal distance. We've tested it. 15 didn't work as well. 25 didn't work as well. It's 20 feet because people they feel welcomed but not pushed upon. Central to modern campaigns now are the analytics team. And most of American campaigns, right down to the legislative level, have at least a volunteer who's looking at what's working and counting the activity on a daily basis. Classically, Rick Perry, who is no longer with us as a presidential candidate, tested voter recall of his television ads. And what did he learn? That after 4 days after a television ad had been airing for 2 weeks, after 4 days, voters had absolutely zero recall of what was said in the ad. But they did have an emotional response. They did have a sense of what the content sort of was and how they felt about the ad. It was sort of yeah, I saw it and I thought it was okay. But they couldn't tell you what was really okay. And so what did we learn? We learned that if you go on television, you got to stay on television. Remember, number 2, all politics today is personal, customized, and interactive. No longer is Tip O'Neill's famed statement, all politics is local, appropriate. Today, politics has gotten personal. As a candidate, you must not only communicate that you understand a voter's concerns, but also that you are in touch with that voter's particular value structure. That means that you have to demonstrate that you're in tune with the concerns of the voters in a particular state you may have to give up a news broadcast to a national audience to demonstrate your local roots. And you may do so by going hunting for doves or deer or something that demonstrates that you understand the culture and the activities of that individual group that you have targeted. But it's gone further than that. Politics today is customized. It goes beyond personal to the fact that we have collected, in many cases, not just in the United States, but we've done this in the UK, Australia, and increasingly in other European countries. We've collected data on individuals from their computer IP address and purchased behavior indicators of what they have purchased, and then matched it to a voter file. For a particular campaign I was working on in the United States, in Colorado, which was something that you would not have to deal with here in Denmark, which is to stop genetically modified foods and organisms in our food, we sent emails and a specific video about baby food with GMOs to women 30 to 50 years old who had recently purchased baby products, including diapers and baby food, and that, more importantly, that these were women who, based on their purchasing at local stores, sometimes, but not always, bought organic food. And that was our target audience. And so we got their IP addresses, and we were able to send a little video about, what happens to don't you want your baby to eat non-GMO food? So vote yes. We were outspent 20 to 1, and that's 20 million to 1. We lost. But social media has taken over as well. And that has caused the interactive development. It's not sufficient for you to simply communicate to the voters. You must engage voters and interact with them. It's no longer a one-way conversation through email, Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, text messaging. It's all interactive. And more importantly, voters expect it to be interactive. Why? How many of you have ever been online with a chat situation over on a product or with an airline or something like that, where you're going back and forth and online with somebody for a problem? I'd be very surprised if some of you have not done that. Yeah. Okay, guess what? Voters now expect that kind of interaction between candidates and parties because they've gotten that individual attention. And it's been online, and it's been between them and the customer service. So if you're a candidate or a party that's not providing that kind of, if you will, voter service or customer service, they really don't think that you exist. You're not playing on their terms. And this is not just true in the US. We've done some significant data mining activities in the UK, and more importantly, what we're seeing is that such activities such as telephone town halls, which we used extensively in Sweden during the last 2 weeks of the Swedish elections, we used a telephone town hall where the now Prime Minister spoke to over 800,000 people in organized town halls on the telephone of 50 to 60,000 people on the phone at one time. And this is extremely useful for feedback and for creating that interactive sense with the voters. We've used it not just for politics, but for sports teams, for instance, that want to talk to their season ticket holders or their club members. Remember, all politics, all customers are now demanding interactive behavior. Meanwhile, don't forget the message. Content matters. There's a tendency in the era of customization to forget the message because they're trying to reach the voter with a very customized message about them, but you better have an overarching theme because otherwise voters get confused. What is this really about? What are they talking about? And if they hear something from somewhere else, it has to connect to them. Keep your messaging. Focus on a real message. And that sounds really strange, but in American politics, you'll see often we have raised X amount of money. Our statement was retweeted 350 times. We have 30,000 Facebook likes. These are wonderful numbers, and I'm thrilled that people are counting these things. But that's not a message. A message tells people who and what you're fighting for, tells you your vision for the activity, for why you should be elected. And it tells you the direction, change or stay the same that you want to go, and the values that you hold dear, and ideally provide some contrast with your opposition. And yet, you see, a press spokesman said, "We're very successful. We have 30,000 Facebook likes." That is not a message. And strangely, when we look at this today, you know, there's been a lot of popular movements, popular grassroots movements. But if you're running for office, you should be the standard bearer of your party, or you should run as a candidate, not as the head of a movement. Because movements don't win campaigns. Candidates win campaigns. And this is particularly true in the United States, where we've had the history of movement candidates, from my boss Howard Dean to Gene McCarthy to George McGovern to Huckabee, who've been at the forefront of movements of various sorts. And ultimately, voters focus on that and realize that a movement candidacy often doesn't meet the mark of being someone who has broad enough experience, capability, and vision to be an elected candidate. There are exceptions. There was some guy named Obama who, in 2007, was really at the head of a movement for change. But around November of 2007, you begin to look at his speeches, you begin to look at his responses in debates, and you realize this guy moved from being the head of a movement to being a candidate for President of the United States. Now, this doesn't mean that movements can't have some electoral success, particularly in multi-party situations, where that they can provide an outlet for sort of grassroots populism. But what we're finding is that in some of those cases, that even when they were elected, that voters now turn back and say, really? Did I really vote for that person? Because they're finding them ill-fit to handle the real problems of government. And you can see this in a number of places in the States, and I think we can all look at a variety of different places throughout Europe where you're seeing movement candidates succeeding and all of a sudden finding the challenges of governing to be extraordinarily difficult. And finally, in fact, be wary of the grassroots movements because they will pull you to the left and to the right, and you will have to abandon the center. And I can give you no better example of that than Jeb Bush and what's happening with Jeb Bush. And here was a guy who came in as a center-right Republican. And every single day, he's making a statement that's moving him farther and farther to the right because of the demands of the grassroots, rightist, populist movement that has been very supportive of Donald Trump, has been very supportive of other non-politicians. And we see the same thing on the Democratic left with Bernie Sanders. It is true that anybody who's anti-establishment in Iowa will get 35%. You could put Donald Duck up there and say, 35, they will get 35% if they said, I'm not the establishment candidate. But these movements are moving people, and we see this in Sweden, we've seen this in Spain, we've seen it in other places. There are those who suggest it's happening here in Denmark, that the middle is being pulled apart by candidates and parties that have to answer to their, shall we say, the wings of the political spectrum. And finally, I want to say, and this is an easy one for Europeans, but it's a very important one in the U.S. Most U.S. consultants and campaigns do not have, if you will, work in multi-candidate fields, only in primaries. And really, only in primaries for president will you see 8 or 10 candidates, whereas here in Europe, that's the norm with 8 or 10 parties. But the rule is, in a multi-candidate field, using negative advertising can have unintended consequences. In other words, if you go negative on if you're candidate A and you go negative on candidate B, those voters don't necessarily go back to you on A. They may go to C, D, E, and F. So you have to be very careful on what you're planning to do. And that's something that most political consultants in the U.S. never really think about. And in 2004, I saw Dick Gephardt's team go negative on Howard Dean in the Iowa caucuses. Now, Howard Dean said, well, I'm going to respond. So he did, against Dick Gephardt. The problem is all the voters went to John Kerry and John Edwards. Didn't help them. So you have to be very careful. One final notion that I want to bring up, and that is always ask yourself, how are you going to win? And the reason I say this is that in American politics, we have this wonderful primary system, but that's, and often what we have is a dilemma. And the dilemma is very simple. Do you position your candidate to win the general election? Or do you position your candidate to win the primary? In baseball terms, which is probably ineffective here, but you can't win the World Series without winning the playoffs, and you can't win the playoff. You cannot, ultimately build a team to win the playoffs and lose the World Series. So this is a classic dilemma for American politics in the primary season. Similarly, in Europe, what we're seeing is people and parties picking people who best represent the party and the party faithful, but who have zero chance of expanding the base and the strength of that party over the long term. There was one other piece of advice I told my friend, and I said, just tell your candidate, remember, get sleep. Because that one moment where they're really tired is when they make that really big mistake. Thank you very much, and let me take any questions, and I would love to hear anybody's response to the dilemma of I hate Southern accents. Thank you.
It's perfect. We have time for questions. We do have a few minutes for questions, and we also have microphones going around. So please put up a hand or something like that if you have any questions for Rick Ritter, or if you have the answer to how you would spin the I don't like Southern accents. Earlier when I talked to you, you also said there was another advice. I don't think you brought it up. The one with the wives or the spouses? What was that?
Oh, my God. Well, that, yeah. Yeah, there was a moment in my life where I got a phone call. It was actually, I was in the campaign headquarters, and the campaign manager comes over to me, and he says, we got a problem. So what's the problem? He said, the candidate's wife. And I said, there's a rule among political consultants, which many of my friends no longer do candidates. And I asked one of my friends, I said, you don't do candidates? And he said, no, I only do initiatives and referenda. And I said, well, why? And he said, it's easy. Initiatives and referenda have no spouses. And I said, okay, so what's the problem here? He said, well, it's about the spouse. And I said, what's happening with the spouse? She just came back from a self-awareness symposium. And I said, that's great, that's a good thing. Yeah, but she's decided to demonstrate her personal awareness by driving down the interstate highway in a convertible with the top down. I said, that's great, that's wonderful, that's no problem. She said, no, she has no clothes on. And I said, well, we have to call the candidate and have the candidate call his wife and say, please put your clothes back on. And so I called the candidate, and the candidate said, oh, no, I can't call my wife and tell her that. I said, why not? She said, well, I was the one to go to the self-awareness program in the first place. So she said, I said, okay, so she said, you call her. I said, I call her. No, I'm just the consultant. He said, no, you need to call her. So I looked, of course, to the campaign manager and said, you need to call her. And he said, all right. So he calls her and comes back, slams down the phone. And I said, what did she say? And she said, she needed to give the girls some air to breathe. I said, the girls? There's no girls in the car. She said, yes, referring to her breath. And I said, oh, my God. The only good news was there were no members of the press around, which saved us. But again, we kept thinking, what would we say to the press if we had to, acknowledge that the candidate's wife had driven for 100 miles bare-breasted down the streets through California?
Rick, I think somehow that's going to be your last words. Are you okay with that? Or no, I think just one final thing you have to address very shortly. Hillary, is she going to make it?
Hillary's going to make it.
Through the primaries.
I think so. I think she's going to make it. And don't underestimate Donald Trump. I think there's been underestimation of Trump for a long time. This is a man who has built his brand over the last 10 years on American television. What he is doing now is nothing more than extending his brand and using the positive elements of that brand to run for President of the United States. People in the United States are very comfortable with this brand. They've seen it once a week on TV doing the same act. Why wouldn't he be doing the same act running for president? It's very simple. When you start thinking about building brands, take a look at Donald Trump, and it shows you how you can expand a brand from one endeavor, building golf courses and hotels, to running for President of the United States.
Thank you very much,
Thank
Rick
you.
Ritter. Let's give a big hand to Rick.